All right, let's jump into this. So welcome everybody to today's Cerini Connection, where we're going to be talking about mergers and acquisitions. I'll be speaking with one of my partners today at Cerini Associates, Ed McWilliams. Ed runs our tax department and does a lot of work with companies looking to buy and sell. And we're going to be, again, talking about both from a nonprofit and a business perspective, mergers and acquisitions and how you can use that to grow, expand, impact, and achieve, long-term goals. We encourage you as we're going through this to please ask questions. You can ask those questions in the chat and I will work them into the presentation. So Ed and I will address, like I said, as we go along. So Ed, thank you for being part of today and for jumping on.
Thanks for having me, Ken.
So let's kind of start off a little bit about why are more nonprofits and for-profit businesses kind of turning to the whole merger and acquisition route right now. We're seeing a lot of activity these days.
Yep. So as you said, it's been a very, very hot market in mergers and acquisitions, probably since the start of 2024. Everybody needed some time to readjust to the changes in interest rate environment that was happening during 22 and 23, which slowed everything down. And then into 24, we started to see an increase in this. And really, on both the nonprofit and the for-profit side, you're kind of seeing the same drivers for both of these. Number one, there's been a lot of market consolidation due to uncertainty and inflationary pressure. So that consolidation is requiring organizations to really consider M&A to be a growth, a opportunity, a path for them to either continue to grow moving forward to achieve their goals, and or for organizations that are acquiring to looking to grow their business or their organization for the next step. Next, you have kind of access to the capital and the funding streams that you would see in nonprofits. So a larger organization is typically going to have more access to capital. That capital is going to be very, very important to help drive all of these growths on a business perspective. Similarly, when you look at nonprofit organizations, normally larger organizations have a little bit of an easier time with funding sources than smaller organizations too. It's kind of like the old personal finance quote where the first million is the hardest to make, and then it kind of grows from there. Very, very similar approach applies in the nonprofit sector where organizations that have 250 to maybe $1 million of support, they find that they're scratching and clawing to get every dollar of that support. But once you get into your real large nonprofit providers, everything starts to get a little bit more easier and organically driven on all of that. You're seeing, and this is not really the topic we're going on today, but a lot of technology acceleration. So a lot of M&A items now are really being driven by this idea of, hey, is there technology that we can either build or buy, really looking in kind of the AI and LLM language machine learning spaces. So you're seeing a lot of M&A work and a lot of M&A activity going around those for both the nonprofit and the for-profit sectors. And then I think one of the more interesting ones is you're starting to see this long-standing trend of succession issues come into play, where organizations have said for years, oh, we're not sure what our succession plan is, and may not have that next generation of leadership available to help drive them to their next step, and or in a for-profit setting, um, have the desire or capability to buy these people out. So that succession issue becomes very front and center and somewhat makes this M&A more a strategic necessity in many cases than an opportunistic choice.
Yeah, I think in the nonprofit field, I think some of it is if you look at certain pockets of the nonprofit sector, there are certain governmental pressures also that are kind of pushing when you're dealing with some of the areas like SNAP programs, Medicaid, all of the things that there's potential concerns with at the federal level. If you've got a program that's kind of heavy into those programs, it could be a situation. So I don't know. I think when I'm a baseball fan, you're a baseball fan. You get close to the the trade deadline and the various baseball teams are kind of looking and saying, is this a time that I should be a buyer or a seller? Am I going to make the playoffs? Am I not going to make the playoffs? I mean, what's that whole thought process that kind of nonprofits go through and for-profit businesses go through to make that determination? Hey, based on where I am right now, am I a buyer? Am I a seller? Am I just going to hold pat? What does that kind of look like?
Well, I mean, as a Met fan, aren't you familiar to only being a seller? I don't think being a buyer is something that you're really accustomed to. So I don't know how great of a situation that is. Um, when you're thinking about making this decision, I think the first thing you want to do is make sure that your leadership and your key stakeholders are all aligned on what the goal you're looking for here is, are willing to make this structural change, and that everybody kind of has the boat rowing in the same direction. I think leadership buy-in, whether that be owners of the business, whether that be owners and the executive team on the for-profit side, whether that be the board, the executive directors on the nonprofit side, everybody needs to understand exactly what it is they are looking to get out of this, why they are looking to do this, what makes them either a buyer or a seller in this capacity or in this situation here, and then what is their much like when you're going into other, you think about networking events, right? One of the first questions everybody asks you at a networking event is, what does your ideal client look like? Well, you want to, as an organization, be saying, hey, as a someone looking to acquire, what does our ideal acquisition look like? If you're an organization who's saying, hey, we think we are a good target to be acquired, or for us to continue to operate in the manner that we want to and achieve our goals, what would be a good person to acquire us? You want to find that right target and that right person, and having your leadership team be aligned and ready with all of that is going to be super important as we get there. And then you want to make sure that those organizations that you're looking at, whether as a acquirer or an acquiree, do they have a clear match of what your core strengths and non-negotiables are and what your core fundamentals are? Does everything make sense for you from that perspective? And then say, okay, hey, does this work as a fit? And are we as an organization going to be better off or worse off as we move forward in this process? And something I've told buyers in the past, and maybe jumping a little ahead here, people look at these letters of intent like they are death do us part sort of things. Just because you start going down the path of a merger and acquisition, until the deal is signed, that doesn't mean that you are forever committed to this idea either. So you always have to keep that in mind too, that there's nothing permanent about even just exploring opportunities and knowing what the opportunities are out there, because what may not be something you're interested in December 2025 could be a real possibility of interest by, let's say, January 2027, right? Things can change that fast. So even if you're not currently in the market, so to speak, or playing the field, that doesn't mean you shouldn't have a sense of, hey, what do I have available and what's going on?
So I guess that opens up several questions. The first is from a strategic thought process. And as I'm going through a kind of a strategic thought process, how often should I be evaluating where I am and whether I am a buyer, seller, or whatever? How often should that process be taking place? And you, again, I guess you said it's up at the upper level, owner, manager level, but how often should we be thinking about this? This is the first question.
I don't know if there's necessarily a set routine, but I think as you are having other strategic discussions, so when you're in, this is a very accountant term of me, but when we're in budget season, when everybody's kind of looking at their budgets for the next year, maybe 3 or 5 year forecasts, that's a really good time to be thinking about this. It's a natural segue into thinking about these sort of decisions because your mind is somewhat in that where am I currently, where am I going forward mind frame, and you have usually a bunch of the necessary stakeholders that you're going to need available and their mind is currently in there. So I think that's a really good time to be thinking about that. But I also think one of the things that makes any organization, nonprofit or for profit, successful is this is something that they are thinking about and have time set aside for when they're doing their overall top level strategic meetings with these key stakeholders. Whatever point in the year they do that, it's always the again, to use another old quote, working in your business versus working on your business. Very, very, similar concept here of there are times when it makes sense where you need to take a step back with your key stakeholders and be looking at things strategically. And that would be a great time to be doing that whenever that organically can happen for you within the cycle of what you're doing. But it is something that you should also make sure is on your agendas for there at some point in time. And even if it's just a, hey, what are we seeing in the marketplace? What have some of our competitors done? What have some of our peers done? What makes sense for that? What's currently going on? Because understanding that and understanding your place in the marketplace can also help drive some of those other decisions that can exist.
Yeah, so it's like doing a SWOT analysis, figuring out what that SWOT analysis is telling us, like strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and then kind of utilizing that to determine kind of a course of action, which could be a merger or acquisition.
Correct. Yep.
So when you talked about, evaluating potential partners. So when you do evaluate those potential partners, what are the key factors that a leader of a business or a nonprofit should be thinking about? Is it finances? Is it mission alignment? Is it culture? Is it whatever, something else?
So that's the answer is really all of the above, right? And I love good cliches and quotes, so you're gonna get another one from me right now. If you ask a barber if you need a haircut, he's gonna say yes. So if you ask an accountant what the most important item you want to consider when evaluating partners, your financial health and their financial health is going to be one of the most paramount things right there. You want to make sure that you are selling and or merging at a time that makes sense for your business, that your numbers are strong when you're doing it, but you also want to make sure wherever you're merging into is a solid foundation to merge into. Do they have strong, sustainable financial support? Whether that comes from outside funding sources in the nonprofit sector, whether that is debt or equity commitments in the for-profit sector. You want to know in evaluating these, hey, how am I, especially on the for-profit side, how am I going to get paid what I'm trying to sell my business for? You don't want it to be a situation where you say to someone says, "Oh, I want to offer you 10x your business value or 10x your bottom line for your business." And you go, "Wow, that's a great offer. I really like that." You start going through your diligence process, and then they come back to you and say, "Okay, great. I'm go. We have a handshake deal. Now I got to go find the money to actually pay this," which is something I experienced this year of someone made an offer and said, "Oh, this is all contingent on us actually finding financing on all of this." And everybody felt like they just wasted their time. And on the nonprofit side, you want it to be, hey, we have what our missions are, what our core ideals are that require this financial commitment to undertake. Can this organization help support those, help grow those, help make sure that that mission continues if we were to merge into this organization? So again, you ask me this question, finance is always going to be first and foremost, but don't let that be your only consideration. I think culture and operational compatibility are really, really important items that you need to consider in any merger and acquisition conversation. Most of these M&A deals are going to have some sort of period afterwards where everybody's working together. Now, in a case where you're trying to sell or maybe retire, that can only be a few years. In a case where it's a long-term merger of equals, that could be the next 20 years. And you want to make sure that these people you are working with are people that culturally align with how you operate, with how your morals and professionalism and your work product work through. And you want to make sure that they operationally do the same thing. You don't want to be running with people where you're a proactive planner and they are reactive people who do things at the last minute. That's an operational incompatibility. If you're someone that's always planning ahead and wanting to, be prepared for stuff, and you have other people that are just like, oh, we're going to fly by the seat of our pants and we'll figure out problems as they come, both of which are management styles that can exist, well, that's an operational incompatibility. And that's going to be very, very difficult in the long term because you're going to have culture strife and you're going to have a lot of friction between you and whom you are now merging and acquiring with. And getting past that, even if all the numbers can make sense, can kill deals.
Yeah. So how do I pretty my business or nonprofit up to make it more attractive on either side, whether I'm a buyer or a seller? How do I kind of gussy myself up to make me more attractive?
Ken, there's not enough lipstick in the world to gussy you up. But so when people start talking to us about this and people start saying, "Hey, I'm thinking about doing this, my long term, and my focus is more in the nonprofit or the for-profit sector, so obviously that's where I'm going to draw back on, but a lot of these are very similar across both sides here. When people start having these conversations with us, the very first thing I ask, first question is your house in order? And a lot of times you get the, oh, yeah, but. And everything after but is where you find out where your house is not in order. And the first thing I will say to everybody is okay, let's get your house in order before we even start thinking about this. Do you have defined practice and policy manuals? Do you have written documentation for all of your client and vendor contracts? Do you have proper agreements for all of debt agreements that you have, any capital agreements that you have, partnership agreements, member agreements, employment agreements, executive director, are all your board minutes completely set up? You want to make sure that you have your house, whether you are a buyer or a seller, completely in order before you start anywhere within this process. Only then can you really start thinking about the next steps on that. And typically during an evaluation, during the due diligence process, there will always be adjustments, excuse me, that are made by either buyers or sellers that will take what are the reported numbers that you have and adjust them based on certain items, which are management adjustments that can exist. So, like example of this might be if you have a closely held business and you have one of your kids on payroll doing, back office tasks, that isn't someone that isn't something, an expense that a buyer would expect to continue on a go forward basis. So they may adjust for that accordingly. Similarly, if you're having new contracted rates come in for whatever it is you may do, whether it be for your revenue within a for-profit enterprise or your support systems in nonprofit enterprise, if there are new prospective rates coming out, well, you may wish to evaluate saying, hey, we're currently only doing this on these rates, but when the new rates come in, we expect to change to ABC. You may have to normalize for owner's compensation. Some businesses, there is no compensation taken by the owner who acts as the executive. Well, there should be some sort of executive that needs to be there. In some organizations, there may be people that are being paid beyond what a market rate may be for whatever reason. So, those are adjustments that you don't necessarily need to make prior to going through this process, but they're items that you want to make sure you have identified yourself and you want to make sure are reasonable, because these are very, very customary adjustments that happen in private sector M&A deals all the time, of management adjustments where you are adjusting to eliminate either non-recurring things that a new buyer may not have, and or one-time things that may not recur. So let's say you moved offices last year and you had to pay movers and you had to pay a lease termination fee and you had to, get some non-capitalized improvements done to get the space ready for you on a lease. Those are all things that's not a recurring year-to-year OpEx item that is really going to be there. So you want to make sure you have that information quantified and ready to go. And that leads to the next point of making sure when your house is in order, having all of your information readily available and together. You're going to need very clean, reconcilable data that every system agrees to each other. You don't want to be saying your annual payroll is $1 million a year. And then when people start looking at employee by employee payroll, and all of a sudden, like, well, this says it's $1.3 million a year. What's the difference? Oh, well, anything that starts with, oh, well, you automatically are already on the defensive and it's going to start raising flags. So you want to make sure you have a lot of that employee data together, right? A accurate employee census that gives a sense of position, how long they've been there, their any benefits package, any compensation package, and you're going to need detailed customer data and detailed vendor data available too. You want to make sure you have how each customer, because buyers are going to be very concerned about concentration risks. If you have one client that's 40% of your revenue, that's a concentration risk that, hey, if I were to acquire this operation and this one client goes, well, that's a problem. That's something they're going to want to scope out during diligence. Same thing on a for-profit or a nonprofit enterprise. If you have one primary funding source that potentially may not transfer over in this acquisition, well, then that's something that needs to be known and aware of. So you need to make sure you have a lot of that detail level data, much more in depth than you would think you would need, especially if you're used to going through a financial statement audit process, wherein while we audit numbers during that, we're equally worried about the environment that generated those numbers. This is going to be more about those numbers and in much more depth than you may be used to going through.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things that come up from there. If you're in a healthcare environment, whether it be for-profit or nonprofit, you have to make sure that any licenses are transferable, depending on the business structure you're taking in terms of the merger and acquisition. So there's a whole bunch of other factors that come into play.
Well, not transferability of licenses and contracts is huge, and that's something, and it's more of a legal item than a accounting M&A item,
Mhm.
but the transferability of certain contracts can really change how, particularly on a for-profit acquisition, but even on a nonprofit, how certain deals can be structured. Because, and this is, you hit the nail on the head on healthcare. Healthcare, your EIN is what gets credentialed with all of the payers. So when you are looking to acquire a healthcare provider, very frequently you'll need that EIN to continue, and that changes what you can do for those mergers and acquisitions, because you need that EIN to come through. It really kind of removes the more common asset sale you would see in a private environment off the table. If you have non-transferable contracts or non-transferable vendor agreements, can be very important too. Sometimes the secret sauce of what makes an operation worthwhile is in the relationships they have with their vendors. Well, if some of those are non-transferable in the contract, that's something that can really change the structure of this deal and become a huge, item that comes out during diligence. So that's a very crucial point.
Yeah, I've also seen also the importance of staff because sometimes some of the mergers and acquisitions are trying to bring staff together because of the difficulty in finding certain staff types. Judy Siegel had just popped in the chat. She said, and if you're a nonprofit, please remember that if you have to be current with all of your filings with the Attorney General's office, and then most likely the AG will also ask to see your bylaws, conflict of interest policies, and everything else. Also, keep in mind that if you are going through some sort of merger or acquisition, you're probably going to need some level of consent from the Attorney General's office. So that's again something else that needs to be
Well, that's part of
kind
the
of considered.
regulatory due diligence that you would do in this process, right? A very, very common request list is going to be, hey, do you have any correspondence from regulatory agencies, whatever regulatory agency is relevant to your particular facts and circumstances, whether that be state licensing boards, whether that be trade associations, the AG, things of that nature. And then similarly, you'll go through during diligence a lot of looking at tax exposure, right? Again, I'm a tax guy, so that's something I've done a lot of work with, but you have to go through and say, okay, hey, are you filing in all the states that you need to be filing in? Are you paying all the taxes that you need to be paying? How have the last couple of years of returns looked? Are you under examination for any outstanding items? Have you done any voluntary disclosures in the recent past? There's a whole level of diligence that you do beyond just the numbers and beyond just that, and stuff like AG consents and making sure all those filings are done would fall under that area of diligence when you want to go through and really make sure, hey, is this person on either side that I'm going with up to date with all of their crucial regulatory things? Because you don't want to, and I've seen this happen, you don't want to merge your organization into something else and find out, oh, they have a massive unpaid payroll tax issue, which can really hamstring that can bring the ship down really, really easily. So making sure things like that don't exist are as important for the buyer who doesn't want to be buying a problem and for the seller who doesn't want to say, hey, I've sold my organization to you, merged my organization into you, and now this ship is going down. So everything I look to accomplish by doing this is potentially in jeopardy.
I mean, you also have other types of compliance issues, such as, if you were being audited by a governmental agency, would there be risk associated with that audit? What's your Medicaid compliance look like? What does your corporate compliance look like? All of those types of factors come into play also. Um, when you talked earlier about the fact that, when you started talking a little bit about culture of a merger,
Mm-hmm.
what suggestions do you have for evaluating kind of a selling company's culture?
So you want to speak to a wide cross section of various people in the organization beyond just the executive level. You definitely want to get into talking to some of the entry level, lower level employees, some of their back office staff. You want to be able to really try to get a feel for what they are. Now, if you want my honest of honest answers, I would take them out to a bar, give them a couple bottles of wine, and see what they're like when that happens. But I don't think that's really good business advice or life advice. But you want to spend time with them and learn what they are like and see. And the reason I say look at some of the entry level or lower level people, when you see how people treat and work with people at that level, it gives you a real sense of what the organization's philosophy and policy of a whole can be like, and can you know help you understand what they're going through on all of that. This is unfortunately in some ways a lot like dating, in that, before you go out on a date with someone, especially online dating, you have a couple conversations, you shoot a couple texts back and forth. Sometimes these dates work out, sometimes they don't. You have to treat it in a very, very similar item here, where you want to be asking the right questions and be very observant, keeping your head on a swivel. And when you start to observe any cultural red flags, these are things that you want to bring up during this process and make sure you get your concerns out there pretty early so you can hear what their responses are to these sort of things and to understand, okay, hey, this is that, and see how they work through all of that. You're never going to be able to do a full culture analysis or deep dive. You're never going to really get what it's like to work with somebody until you've worked with somebody for a long period of time. But you have to really use your best judgment and use all of the skills that you've developed over time to hire and make decisions and really apply them on overdrive here to feel what that culture thing is. And if you are seeing red flags, keep them in mind.
How important is it for either, well, I guess if you're acquiring an organization, how important is it for that leadership to come across with the acquisition and for that leadership to stay?
I think it depends somewhat on the nature of what you're acquiring, the nature of the business, the nature of the organization, their goals, their mission. I think all of those are going to be very, very dependent on the answer to that question. When I'm on the buy side, I want to make sure that even if it's not the senior executive team that's coming over, whomever they had in the wings and whomever their key lieutenants are and their key people are definitely staying on for the long haul. During your diligence process, you really need to identify, and not just by asking people, but during your overall process, figuring out who are the key levers and drivers of this operation and making sure that they are coming along for this deal and that they are feeling welcome, supported, and in the long haul for it on that. You definitely need the leadership to buy in to make this sort of transaction. And then going forward, what how much of that leadership you need, I think, depends also too on what resources you have readily available for that. If you're acquiring something where it's, hey, I have a management level person with the experience to run a program like this, but for me to build this program off the ground is going to take me 4 years of painstaking labor. Or here's someone that already has this program, but may not be looking to continue doing it going forward. I already have the leader in place. They just don't have the team. So that transition from that leader may not be as important of here's a program I don't offer at all. And I need someone that knows how to do all of these things. And that person being part of everything is going to be very important on the go forward basis because of all of that. And also remember when you are doing a merger or acquisition, particularly as the buy side, as the acquiring company, one of the things, and you hinted at this, Ken, that you are acquiring is their talent, is their employees. And if you see that there's, oh, here's someone that's a future leader of my organization potentially in their ranks right now. They used to call it an acqui-hire, where I'm really looking to bring you on board as a person, not so much your business, because I think you as a person are what I'm looking for. Those are still something that happens and still a very viable strategy.
You've talked a lot about the diligence process. What are some of the biggest risks that you see in terms of organizations kind of overlooking, not really understanding or not really doing what they should be doing in the due diligence process?
So you'll see organizations that their exuberance and excitement for the deal sometimes overrides the common sense of what needs to be done. So they will very often be like, all right, I want this done, now. I want it done as soon as possible. I want to sign this and move forward. And it's like, well, you're not giving us enough time to really go through the entire diligence process through all of that. You also have what I would call the information gap problem, wherein your senior team and or your ownership may be looking to sell, but you may not be looking to give this information out to everybody yet. You don't want to have your staff start saying, oh, do I need to find new jobs, have them check out. You have your right to privacy and your right to keeping this, to yourself, but you need their help to move forward in this process. So you often see bottlenecks and or information delays where it's, oh, the person who has that answer is Ken, but Ken doesn't know we're going through this right now. So I'll have to find a way to ask Ken. You'll tell me, then I'll tell the other side on the diligence thing, and we're playing a game of telephone, and at the very end of it, it says purple monkey dishwasher for no reason, right? So you have a lot of data breakdown that can happen when you're trying to keep that secrecy in place if you need to have it there. And then, not listening to what your advisors are telling you. Sometimes, people can be stubborn and be like, hey, we're looking at this and we think these guys have a massive sales tax obligation that they're not dealing with. I don't care about that. It's not going to be a problem. I'm not worried about it. And then, sure enough, that attaches to your new acquisition. So not listening to the advisory team, not giving them enough time, and that information gap and information difficulty are all areas where diligence has fallen apart and created risk, and also making sure you have the right advisory team in place. Not everybody does everything. So you may have an accountant that you trust who does your financial statement audit, who does your personal tax return, whom you've worked with, but they may not be familiar with certain M&A items. They may have not gone through the process before. They may not know how to help. There's no quantifiable answer, but how to help spot some of these red flags that just may come up when you're working through this process over time, where no one thing is really obvious or like a data point you think, oh, look out for this. But all of a sudden one day you just go, guys, I got to tell you, I've been doing this a while. Something somewhere isn't right here. It doesn't feel right to me. And that's your experience talking. That's the difference between wisdom and knowledge. Knowledge is the ability to recite things. I can recite the Internal Revenue Code for you. That's the knowledge. The wisdom is knowing how that applies in situations and what it actually means in practicality and using that experience with it and making sure you have the right advisor. Same with your legal team. You may have a lawyer that does general work for you. You may have a lawyer that specializes in your healthcare compliance stuff. He's not going to be the guy you want to use that's doing the M&A deal for you. These are very, very complicated contracts that can only go through 6, 10, 15 red lines back and forth. And, they are written, and apologies to any lawyers on, they're long, they're boring, they're full of legalese. Like there's a ton of things in there that, sometimes I don't think anybody even knows why they're in there anymore, but we put them in one deal 15 years ago and we've just been rolling the same thing over. And it's like, oh yeah, that probably should be there, but no one knows what it actually means. Having that right experience and the right team of people helping you, you know, uh, you having an insurance advisor to help you. Hey, what kind of insurance coverages would I need to have in place? Very frequently, a seller will need to have a tail policy on D&O or EPLI, coverages related to the M&A process itself. Having an insurance advisor can make a lot of sense. A financial advisor saying, all right, I'm about to get this financial windfall. What do I do with it? Where does it go? Various special legal advisors. Something I've seen come up in larger deals recently has been an ESG review, the environmental, social, and governance, even on the for-profit side, where they're engaging specialist firms to do diligence on that stuff related to deals. So having that right team in place is super important.
That's awesome. What do you see maybe in some of the more common misconceptions when you're dealing or considering an M&A deal?
So the first one I had hit at is just because you sign an LOI does not mean that you have sold. That just means you have come to an agreement that, hey, if everything works out during diligence and everything goes to the finish line, we would sell to you. The LOI and the final contract are usually months and months apart, a lot of negotiation, late nights, and all of that in between to get there. So just because you start down this road doesn't mean you always are going to finish down this road.
I've actually seen more deals not go through than go through.
Yep, yep. I had a CFO tell me once 48 hours is a lifetime in deal land. Deal can be off, on, off, on, off, on in a matter of 48 hours. So, and that's, I don't know if it's a misconception, but a common thing. Every deal ever, almost, at some point in time, one of the parties is going to have someone somewhere say, yeah, this probably isn't happening, or something came up that we don't know if we can get past this, or we feel like this may not move forward. It happens almost always. And people get discouraged and sad over that and or bothered or concerned. And I try to say, yes, it is possible. But this comes up all the time where someone somewhere discovers something they think is an unsolvable problem, and 8 times out of 10, it gets solved. There's almost always a solution to something on that. In terms of other misconceptions, we kind of hit on the whole transitional aspect here, but this whole idea, okay, I sell today and I'm done tomorrow, very rarely is that going to be the case. There's often going to be some sort of transitional component that you will need to provide, whether it be 6 months, a year, 18 months, or going forward. So, it doesn't mean that you're completely pulling the plug and the next day you don't have any other responsibility. That doesn't really work. Um,
Yeah, I
we
mean,
hit on
we're
culture before,
go ahead.
where it's like, oh, we've seen, hey, we're not sure that culture can is 100% compatible. We'll figure out cultural fit later. That never works. That is a
Oh.
recipe for absolute disaster. They almost never get resolved on that. And I think the other misconception that comes up a lot is, particularly in a more of a merger perspective than maybe an acquisition perspective, is that it's going to save, if you take two failing entities and merge them together, that one bigger entity is now going to be able to save, each entity is going to be able to save each other. And a merger of two struggling organizations just makes one larger struggling organization in place too. So, we've seen that before. People go, well, we're having trouble getting staff, you're having trouble getting staff, or we're having trouble getting funding, you're having trouble getting funding. But if we can get together and make synergies and economies of scale, everything will work out just fine in the end. And then 6 months later, everybody's worse off.
So we have like a couple minutes left, and I really want to get through, I guess, two more questions. I guess the first one is, what do you see as the biggest factors that can blow up a deal?
So, ego can blow up a deal. And thank you for not smirking when I said that, Ken. Um, but egos of the buyers and or the sellers can very often blow up a deal, meaning that as a seller, you may have this feeling, my organization is worth X, 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 and there is no trying to explain to you otherwise that it could be different. And then someone will maybe make you an offer that's close enough to it, and you think you're going to be able to move that forward or move them closer to yours. And in the end, it doesn't happen. And it can happen on the buy side too, where it's someone who's, I'm buying you, so it's now my way or the highway. You don't like it too bad. I have the gold. I'm making the rules, right? So egos can definitely get in the way of all of deals like that. Um, Sometimes the numbers that you get presented and what happens in diligence are completely different things. I've seen deals where someone presents, oh, here's our management adjusted numbers, and their management adjustments are taking every single expense and saying, oh, I'm just selling the revenue, not the expenses, so why are you worried about those? Right? So people will try to make their numbers look as favorable as possible. And when you go into that and you realize, hey, there are significant number issues, financial issues that can exist, that this isn't nearly the deal you thought you were getting. Oh, there's way more operating debt on here than we thought. Oh, their working capital is not very strong. Oh, they have potential compliance issues that they didn't even know they have. They have employee compliance issues, Medicaid compliance issues, all sorts of things like that. During diligence, it's what makes diligence fun, You never know what time bomb you're going to find, but you know you're eventually going to find one, and then you make sure you want to have the right bomb squad there to help you.
All right, so the last question, 30 seconds, because we're out of time. What's the one thing any organization can do right now to position itself for successful M&A in the future, even if they're not actively looking for one?
Make sure that you, as an organization, are prepared to move forward and that your entire team is aligned and believe this is in the best interest of the organization, and make sure your house is in order. Get your house in order before you invite someone in. It's just like the in-laws coming. Make sure the inside of the trash can is clean, because if not, your mother-in-law will find it and be outside the next morning scrubbing it, giving you that dirty look.
So, Ed, first of all, I want to thank you for being part of this. I think a lot of really, really good information for the group. Thank you, everyone, for joining the our Cerini Connection webinar. We hope everybody found this practical and some good insight into mergers and acquisitions. We'll be back again next year with more webinars to share strategies and guidance to your organization. See you in 2026. Have happy holiday season. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.